passenger capacity and public transport options for both islands, and I also appreciate the patience of passengers on other routes disrupted as a consequence of this temporary vessel deployment to help support the islands he has identified.
Jamie Green.
It goes without saying that our islands are open for business, but frustration is an underestimation of the strength of feeling on our islands. What they're actually staring down the barrel of is a summer of more chaos. The MV Caledonian Isles will not be around this summer, and the Glen Sannox has been delayed as well. That simply leaves the Isle of Arran, which is a 40-year-old vessel and prone to break down itself. Is it any wonder that our islanders are nervous about the forthcoming summer season? Maybe I can give the Cabinet Secretary an opportunity to apologise in advance of the chaos that our government is causing.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, if you listen to islanders, they will say it's not necessarily taken as read that the message is that our islands are open for business. And I think it's incumbent on all parties to reiterate that our islands are open for business. In terms of the deployment for the two islands that he mentioned, I did say in my original answer that there is capacity and that the passengers are able to travel. This is a challenge. We undoubtedly know that. But I think it is also important for us to identify there are 6 new vessels that will be delivered for 2026 that will support not just the islands he referred to, obviously Arran in particular, but also Islay, Little Minch, and that also have an impact across the period. I have been upfront saying that this will be a difficult time, particularly with dry docking. But let's get behind our islands, say they're open for business, and do that with a united voice.
A brief supplementary. Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, we know that repairs to the Calais Isles are more extensive than previously anticipated. But how can anyone have any confidence in CalMac's repair timescales that have went from March to June and now August? And how can island businesses plan ahead with these constantly moving goalposts? I'm delighted that she's told everyone and reminded people that Arran is open for business. But what practical steps is the government going to take to get that message over to the wider public who only see bad news on the television and hear it in the radio and read it in the newspapers?
Cabinet Secretary.
I am acutely aware of the impact that the disruptions can have for people and businesses. However, as I stated, there is capacity. There are vessels that are being deployed to support these vital areas, and the complexity of the Calais Isle vessel's design means the repairs must be carried out in a coordinated, controlled manner, which is a highly complex repair effort. I have made it clear to CalMac that I think it would be helpful for them to be upfront and I think realistic about timescales, because that does help some kind of confidence in terms of planning. The island does remain open for businesses and services, and it will continue with the MV Isles of Arran and Alfred. Transport Scotland are urgently considering a request from the Arran Ferry Committee and CalMac to increase funding to enable full passenger capacity on MV Alfred for the period the MV Caledonian Isles is out of service. And I will continue to stress to CalMac the need to clearly communicate that that island remains open for business.
Question number 4, James Dornan.
To ask the Scottish Government what role the Housing Scotland Bill will play in achieving a more sustainable private rented sector.
Minister Paul McLennan.
The Housing Bill includes a package of rented sector reforms that provide additional rights and protections for tenants that aim to improve their experience of renting a home. A fairer, well-regulated rented sector is good for tenants and responsible landlords. The measures we have brought forward in the bill support tenants whilst considering the needs of landlords and will help to drive and deliver a thriving sector that delivers good quality, affordable options for those who rely on it for a home.
James Dornan.
Okay, I thank the Minister for that answer, but can the Minister maybe further outline how the policies in the Housing Bill can benefit tenants by securing an affordable quality home and at the same time benefit landlords seeking to reinvest in their property? Minister.
Can I thank the member for that question? A thriving and fair rented sector that allows landlords to provide good quality homes at a reasonable cost for tenants, of course, is vital for meeting Scotland's housing needs. I will be taking forward the Housing Bill and obviously will continue to discuss that with the sector and other stakeholders going forward.
Thank you. We move to question number 5 and I call Tim Eagle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what activity it will undertake regarding its action plan to address depopulation.
Minister Paul McLennan.
Thank the member for his question. The publication of our Addressing Depopulation Action Plan represents the first phase of a strategic long-term approach to supporting communities experiencing population decline. This includes a range of new commitments aimed at supporting local leadership in responding to these challenges. We have also committed to establishing and addressing depopulation delivery group, working closely with key regional, local and community partners. This group will monitor and evaluate the delivery of the action plan and ensure that the valuable lessons and learning is captured, which can be applied more broadly across Scotland in order to deliver a sustainable solution to these challenges.
Tim Eagle.
The Action Plan's Addressing Depopulation Fund amounts to just £180,000 to be split over 3 local authorities over 2 years. Given the acute shortage of professionals, including doctors, nurses, carers, teachers and more, along with seeing huge amounts of young people moving away from rural areas, isn't the reality, Minister, that this fund is barely a sticking plaster to those communities suffering prolonged loss of local services and an exodus of people?
Minister.
The fund will initially make available £180,000 to be split between a perspective of 3 local authorities. As you mentioned, it will be operational across financial years 24-25 and 25-26. It is intended that the interventions taken forward will generate learning which will be more broadly applicable to communities across Scotland.
Brief supplementary. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister will be aware of Uist being classified as a repopulation zone, providing temporary accommodation and long-term help to find employment and a permanent home for people moving to the area. The Council, the public sector, private sector and communities is involved in this, but they highlight the issue of housing being the biggest issue. So can I ask what the Scottish Government are doing to provide homes to retain and to attract populations to our rural and island communities?
Minister.
Thank you, Member, for the question. I recently visited Uist, I think a number of months ago, and spoke to communities not just around about housing but broader issues that were there. We obviously announced a rural housing action plan in terms of that as well. There's obviously opportunities around about renewables, which might bring additional homes to there. So again, we're engaging with the likes of SSEN in terms of that. I continue to engage with the local authority on that matter. I'm happy to engage with the member further on that if she wishes to do so.
Thank you. Let's keep questions and responses concise. I call Ross Greer.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what action it's taking in response to reports of potential staff redundancies at the Thermo Fisher scientific site in Paisley.
Minister Gillian Martin.
Presiding Officer, I was concerned to learn of proposed job losses at the Thermo Fisher scientific site in Shannon. My immediate thoughts are obviously with the employees affected by this announcement, who are undoubtedly very anxious about their jobs and their futures. I wrote to the company outlining my concerns a number of weeks ago, but I also spoke with them directly this morning to discuss the situation and how they might be redeploying staff where possible. Scottish Enterprise has been engaging with the company, and Scottish Government is on hand to provide support to those facing redundancy through an initiative for responding to redundancy situations, Partnership Action for Continuing Employment, or PACE. PACE has already engaged with the company.
Ross Greer.
I thank the Minister for the work that she's done to support Thermo Fisher staff. Workers at the site have raised concerns with me that the real reason for these potential job losses is offshoring. Thermo Fisher plan to move the jobs overseas to cut costs and maximise profits. While this Parliament has limited powers over employment, there are steps the Government can take to drive up conditions for workers. The Scottish Greens delivered a whole raft of new conditions on the money the Scottish Government spends, ensuring more Scottish workers get paid a real living wage, for example. Given that Thermo Fisher received £150 million worth of contracts from the Government in the last 5 years, will the Scottish Government apply conditions on future contracts to ensure that companies in receipt of huge sums of public money keep those jobs here in Scotland?
Minister.
I'd like to be able to update Mr Greer and the Parliament on some of the things that came out of the conversation, but I will address this point about contracts. Public contracts are awarded to companies in compliance with procurement legislation, as well as international agreements such as the World Trade Organisation's Government Procurement Agreement. Contract terms and conditions are focused on the delivery of the contract and are proportionate and relevant to the contract subject matter. And procurement rules require equal treatment, transparency and proportionality in public procurement processes, precluding the exclusion of companies who conduct their businesses lawfully. But if I can just say, from my meeting this morning, I've heard that 20 employees have been redeployed within the company already, and a number of the affected employees have already found jobs out with Thermo Fisher. But for those that are remaining, all have accepted voluntary redundancy packages with the firm. But the firm's also made a commitment to prioritise them for current in-house vacancies. They've got around 65 vacancies in Chinnen and around 30 across the UK, some of which can allow remote working. I've also contracted a training and services company to be able to train them for recruitment.
Thank you. Question number 7, Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, regarding its plans to achieve net zero by 2045, what its response is to the Electricity System Operators Report beyond 2030.
Minister Gillian Martin.
The Electricity System Operators Beyond 2030 report recommends the need for significant upgrades to electricity networks across GB, bringing forward billions of pounds of investment in networks in Scotland. Expansion of the electricity grid is crucial in enabling us to deliver energy security, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, reduce domestic fuel costs and maximise the economic opportunities of Scotland's abundant renewable resources. It is absolutely imperative that communities have the opportunity to engage in the process at an early stage, and developers must take every opportunity to work with those communities well ahead of submitting any applications for consent.
Douglas Lumsden.
I think we all accept that the grid needs upgrading, but we cannot allow the desecration of the north east of Scotland in achieving this. Many of my constituents in Turriff and Newdeer are alarmed at the scale of industrialisation on their doorstep. So can the Minister confirm that the devolved government will use planning powers in their hands to stop the overdevelopment of these areas?
Minister. Mr Lumsden mentions Turriff and Newdeer, also my constituents as well, and obviously I want to engage with them as much as possible to ensure that they have the opportunity to engage with the TSOs and the electricity system operator about developments in their area so their voices are heard. The Scottish Government, Scottish ministers have no power to instruct transmission owners to opt for any undergrounding cables, for example, or indeed have any influence over the applications that they submit. That is up to them. It is incumbent on them to engage with those communities and bring them with them as they put their submissions forward.
Thank you. That brings general questions to an end, and our next item of business is First Minister's questions. And at question number 1, I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I was going to ask the First Minister when the Cabinet last met and what issues were discussed, but I think we all know. So let's look at what Humza Yousaf said about the SNP's coalition with the Greens. He described it as worth its weight in gold. Today, it's turned to dust. The Greens have called the ending of the Bute House agreement as, these are their words, an act of political cowardice by the SNP, accused Humza Yousaf of selling out future generations. They said he has, and again I'm quoting his former colleague's words, broken the bonds of trust with members. They say he has betrayed the electorate. They called the current First Minister weak. For once, have the Greens finally got something right?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, let me say that what we have achieved with the Bute House Agreement, which, as I've said this morning, has served its purpose, is a record that I will come to very shortly. That Bute House Agreement, of course, that did last and has lasted 969 days, or another way of putting it, well, it lasted, another way of putting it, Presiding Officer, is it lasted 19 Liz Trusses, Presiding Officer. It lasted 19 Liz Trusses. And that record of the Bute House Agreement is a record that has seen the railways taken into public ownership, one that has seen free bus travel for those that are under 22, the banning of the most problematic single-use plastics, and of course the increasing of the game-changing Scottish child payment. Let's remind Douglas Ross that our record is one that we can stand on and one that we can be proud of. Can he say that in stark contrast of a Tory government record that has seen and overseen the biggest fall in living standards on record? A Brexit that has been a complete and utter unmitigated disaster and the worst cost of living crisis in a generation. That's why the Tories are on the brink of an absolute and almighty thumping from the electorate, and they deserve nothing less.
Douglas Ross.
I hope the cameras might be looking at the Greens, who all had their head down there and were not applauding. And let's be clear, the Greens never belonged anywhere near the Scottish Government. Humza Yousaf should have ditched this extreme party on day one of his leadership. But Humza Yousaf said they were worth their weight in gold. In his leadership campaign just over a year ago, he promised to continue the SNP Green alliance. Just 48 hours ago, he wanted the coalition to continue. This morning, he said it came to a natural conclusion. At what point in the last 48 hours did it come to its natural conclusion, or did Humza Yousaf panic because the extreme Greens were about to jump before he could dump them?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, let's again look at the... I know Douglas Ross doesn't want to talk about the substance of policy. Let's look at the substance of policy. Over the last year, we, of course, have been the only part of the United Kingdom to avoid pay-related strike action in the NHS. We've delivered a council tax freeze in every single local authority in Scotland, despite the best efforts of the Conservative Party. We've removed peak fares on our railways, invested record amounts in our NHS, and through our actions, we're estimated to lift 100,000 children out of poverty this year through our actions. And what has Douglas Ross supported over the last year? Douglas Ross and the Tories over the last year have supported the Rwanda bill. They've supported tax cuts for the rich. They've supported a doubling down of austerity that is entrenching, I should say, more children, more households into poverty. He's, of course, supported his colleagues in England to give an insulting offer to doctors and nurses who have been left with no option but to go on strike in NHS England. Huge cuts to Scotland's capital budget, Presiding Officer. So I'm immensely proud of what my party has achieved, not just over the last few years as part of the Bute House Agreement, but what we've achieved in the last 17 years in government. I bet Douglas Ross and the Conservative Party can't say the same thing about their party.
Douglas Ross.
Well, the First Minister completely avoided saying what happened in that 48-hour period where he was determined for the coalition deal to continue and now say it's reached its natural conclusion. But I think, based on the answers we've just heard, it wasn't practising the lines that he's using today, because they are dismal. There is no defence at all. We said from the very beginning this was a coalition of chaos, and it has ended in absolute chaos. Humza Yousaf's government is in crisis. It has unravelled. He has abandoned...
First Minister, colleagues,
I think the first...
Colleagues, let's conduct our business in an orderly manner and let's not shout at one another.
I think the First Minister might be a bit tetchy today. I wonder why. He has abandoned the platform he stood on. He claims it's now a new beginning. But really, it's the beginning of the end. Isn't Humza Yousaf a lame duck First Minister?
First Minister.
What an astonishing set of accusations to come from a Conservative. For a Conservative to even utter the words chaos, the party of Boris Johnson, Presiding Officer, the party of Liz Truss, the party of a Prime Minister that was outlasted by a lettuce, Presiding Officer, the party of Kwasi Kwarteng, the party of the disastrous mini-budget, the party of Brexit, to utter the words chaos. No wonder Douglas Ross is getting redder and redder and redder, Presiding Officer. They are a party, Presiding Officer, that have decided time and time again to attack the most vulnerable in our society. They are a party that time and time again have denied climate science. They are a party that has inflamed community tensions. In terms of the Bute House Agreement, yes, we can point to the fact that we've committed £75 million of the 10-year transition fund for the North East of Moray. We can point to free bus travel for the under-22s. We can point to the great strides that we've made in lifting children out of poverty. We can point to the fact that we have some of the most generous grants for clean heat right across the UK. The Tories have not, Presiding Officer, in Scotland won an election in well over half a century. With Douglas Ross in charge, that ain't changing anytime soon.
Douglas Ross.
Humza Yousaf described this as a coalition that was worth its weight in gold. He stood on a platform to continue it, and now that deal is broken. This week, First Minister jumped before the Green members pushed him. Even his nationalist colleagues don't trust him. Presiding Officer, I can confirm today that on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives, I am lodging a vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf. He is a failed First Minister. He is focused on the wrong priorities for Scotland. He has governed in the SNP's interests and not in Scotland's interests. He is unfit for office. Shouldn't this be the end of the road for this weak First Minister?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, the Conservatives are nothing if they are not predictable, Presiding Officer. And here is an opportunity for oppositions to show what they are really made of. Do they want to govern in the national interest? Do they want to come together with ideas? Do they want to collaborate? Or are they going to play, as Douglas Ross has demonstrated, political games? And they will be judged very poorly on that. If they want to be judged on the record, let me say it's a record that we and I stand very proud of. The fact that our actions will lift an estimated 100,000 children out of poverty. It's our actions that, of course, have seen the fact that we've removed peak rail fares from our railways. It's our action that has seen a council tax freeze helping households in the midst of a cost of living crisis. So I'll leave it to Douglas Ross to play the political games that he wants to play. And if he wants to put our record and his gut party's record on the line, let's do that. There's a general election coming this year, and I can guarantee you that the electorate will give the Conservative Party an almighty thumping, show them the door, and they deserve nothing less.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, in 2021, Nicola Sturgeon said the Bute House agreement meant bold policy action on pressing issues. She told us it would mean a commitment to more affordable housing, a better deal for tenants, steps to accelerate our transition to net zero, and a focus on green jobs. But less than 3 years on, under his weak leadership, the affordable housing budget has been slashed. New rents are rising faster in Scotland than the rest of the UK. Climate targets have been abandoned, and the only 2 green jobs created, Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater's, have now come to an end, just like the Bute House agreement. But with this government's record of failure and incompetence, people across Scotland will be asking, why have only 2 ministers lost their jobs today?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Anna Sarwar asked me about a whole range of climate change-related questions. Of course, this is the week where we've just seen consenting and approval for the world's largest commercial round for floating offshore wind. It puts Scotland at the very forefront of offshore wind development globally. Let's also look at Labour's credibility when it comes to tackling climate change. They are, of course, the party that ditched their commitment to invest £28 billion in green energy, giving in to pressure from the Tories, risking squandering Scotland's immense renewable energy potential. Labour in Glasgow used to support a low-emission zone, then of course tried to stop it from being introduced. They teamed up with the Tories to oppose workplace parking levies. So whether it's at Westminster, whether it's at Holyrood, whether it's in councils across the country, Labour is guilty of not just the worst type of political cowardice, they are guilty of hypocrisy and, frankly, climate denial when the SNP is taking the action that is necessary. So I say to Anna Sarwar, we will continue to support and take action where necessary to tackle not just the climate crisis, but the nature crisis as well. Wouldn't it be quite something that, as opposed to opposing every measure we take to tackle the climate crisis, that Anna Sarwar actually supported it and demonstrated he's serious about tackling the climate emergency?
Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, I'm happy for Humza Yousaf to delude himself that everything's going well and he's having a great week. Keep it up, First Minister. The First Minister actually spent weeks defending this discredited government, and he protests now. But if Humza Yousaf won't listen to me, perhaps he'll listen to Humza Yousaf. Because just days ago, he said the Bute House agreement was worth its weight in gold. He was pleading, I know the Deputy First Minister won't want to hear this, he was pleading the Green Party members to keep his shambolic government together. I hope that the cooperation agreement will continue. I hope that Green members will also see the benefit of that cooperation. But now he's been forced into a humiliating U-turn, and he knows it. These are his words. I can't imagine being the leader of the SNP and the first thing I do is destabilise the government by going into a minority government. I think that would be a tremendously foolish thing to do. Does he feel tremendously foolish today?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, not content with stealing Tory policies, Anna Sauer is now nicking Tory lines, Presiding Officer, when it comes to the questions that he asks.
Let's hear the First Minister.
This year, Anna Sauer talks about
hear the First Minister.
Principles. Let me remind Anna Sauer about his record when it comes to his principles. Anna Sauer described lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses when the Tories did it as economically illiterate and morally repugnant. But then, of course, when Keir Starmer does it, Anna Sauer, like a good boy, falls into line. Anna Sauer used to oppose the two-child limit. He now supports Keir Starmer in retaining it. He used to, of course, believe in progressive taxation. He now supports tax cuts for the wealthy at the expense of public services. Isn't it the case, Presiding Officer, that the only principles Anna Sauer has are those that Keir Starmer tells him he's allowed to have, Presiding Officer?
Anna Sauer.
Presiding Officer, I'm rebuilding my party and looking forward to the next general election. He's destroying his party and wants to run away from a general election. Because this First Minister is claiming that this is all a sign of strength. The louder he shouts, the weaker he sounds. But for once, people agree with Lorna Slater. He is weak, hopeless and untrustworthy. Now, the challenges facing our country have never been so great. But Scotland's government has never been so poor and its leadership has never been so weak. 1 in 7 Scots are stuck on an NHS waiting list as he fails to get a grip of the NHS crisis. Families are struggling to make ends meet while this government wastes public money. And green jobs are going elsewhere while he scraps Scotland's climate targets. The people of Scotland can see that the SNP have lost their way. They're weak, divided, incompetent and putting party before country. The people of Scotland didn't vote for this First Minister. The people of Scotland didn't vote for this mess and this chaos. So isn't it time to end the circus and call an election?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, of course, the country will be going to the polls, I hope, sooner rather than later in a general election. Here's the message that each of us will be able to take. I'll be able to look in the whites of the eyes of the people of Scotland on every doorstep in the country, and I can say that they should be able to vote for a party whose values are the people of Scotland's values. That's through our actions, because our actions are estimated to lift 100,000 children out of poverty. That's a party that has chosen investment in the NHS over tax cuts for the wealthy, a nation where, of course, the only one in the United Kingdom that hasn't had junior doctors or nurses going or strike. While Anna Sauer's party is the party that would lift the cap on bankers' bonuses but retain the cap on child benefits. A party that wants to retain the rape clause, a party that wants to spend billions of pounds on the obscenity of nuclear weapons, not on reducing household poverty. The party that wants to keep Scotland out of the European Union. Presiding Officer, Anna Sauer used to believe in many of the values that this government believes in. He has, of course, flip-flopped, dumped and ditched those principles because his bosses in London have told him to do. That is the height of hypocrisy, and the people of Scotland will see through it, Presiding Officer.
Question number 3, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when the Cabinet will next meet.
First Minister.
On Tuesday, Presiding Officer.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. The two partners to this failed agreement are at each other's throats. They are now trying to blame each other, but in reality, they have both failed the people of Scotland. Together, they have cut our NHS off at the knees. They have butchered the housing budget. They have junked climate targets and made life harder for business. Islanders still don't have the ferries they desperately need, and Scottish schools are tumbling down the international rankings. The First Minister is ditching things left, right and centre. 2 clowns have left the clown car, but this circus continues. We don't just need an end to the Bute House agreement. We need an end to this entire government.
Mr Cole-Hamilton, I will just remind you of the requirement that you treat all members with courtesy and respect.
Well, then I apologise, Presiding Officer. We don't just need an end to the Bute House agreement. We need an end to this entire government. When will Humza Yousaf finally look at himself in the mirror and say, I'm the problem, it's me?
First Minister.
That's all I got, a thumping endorsement from the 4 Liberal Democrat MSPs in this chamber, Presiding Officer. And maybe I should listen to what Alex Cole-Hamilton has to say, because if there is a lesson in relation to coalitions and cooperation agreements, we should probably remember the lesson of the Liberal Democrats, Presiding Officer, when they entered into a disastrous coalition with the Conservatives, which ushered in 14 years of austerity that to this day, of course, people are suffering the consequences. Why Alex Cole-Hamilton leads a party that couldn't even field a 5-a-side football team, Presiding Officer. So what have we achieved as part of the Bute House Agreement, but also 17 years in government? Well, what we've achieved over the last year is the only part of the United Kingdom to have avoided pay-related strike action in the NHS. We delivered a council tax freeze that is helping households up and down the country. We removed peak fares on our railways, invested record amounts in the NHS, and through our actions are lifting 100,000 children out of poverty. So when that general election is called by the Conservatives, we'll take our record proudly to every single doorstep in the country. I don't think Alex Cole-Hamilton can do the same.
Question number 4, Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether he will provide an update on NHS Scotland's ability to treat patients in light of the reported scarcity of life-saving medicines in the UK due to Brexit.
First Minister.
I know reports of medicine shortages are, of course, concerning for patients and their families, so I do thank Kevin Stewart for a really important question. Although these shortages are caused by several factors, such as manufacturing issues, an increase in global demand, a recent report by the Nuffield Trust makes it abundantly clear that the situation has undoubtedly been exacerbated by Brexit and associated loss of European supply chains and authorisations. While the supply of medicines is reserved to the UK Government, I want to reassure the Chamber that NHS Scotland has robust processes in place to manage shortages when they arise. And in most instances, there are alternative products which can be prescribed. I'd encourage anyone experiencing difficulties with shortages to speak to their doctor or pharmacist, and we continue to press the UK Government, the industry and health boards to find a lasting solution to minimise the impact on patients.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. And the research by the Nuffield Trust has revealed that there are shortages in the UK of life-saving medicines such as antibiotics, epilepsy treatments, medicine for ADHD and vital chemotherapy drugs such as cisplatin and carboplatin, which has all been exacerbated by Brexit and the UK's broken supply chain. Can the First Minister once again assure the Chamber and the public that the Scottish Government are doing all within its powers to alleviate shortages and ensure that folks get the medicines that they need? And does he share my view that the situation is yet another symptom of the sickness that is broken Brexit Britain?
First Minister.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Kevin Stewart. This is just another example of the disastrous impacts of Brexit, a Brexit, of course, that the people of Scotland simply did not vote for. I do, however, want to reassure and reiterate to members that NHS Scotland does have robust processes in place to manage those shortages when they arise, and in most instances there are alternative products which can be prescribed. Scottish Government officials are regularly updated on any supply disruptions and will provide advice to the NHS in Scotland on options to address any shortages that may well arise. The Chief Pharmaceutical Officer for Scotland is a member of the UK-wide Medicine Shortage Response Group that has been set up to identify and coordinate responses to any medicine shortages across the UK, providing advice to clinicians on the alternative therapeutic options that exist. As the pricing and supply of medicines is a reserve matter for the UK Government, we will continue to press them to find a lasting solution on minimising the impact on medicine shortages of patients.
Jamie Halker-Johnston.
Last Saturday, campaigners in Portree protested failures in delivering the recommendations of the Ritchie report on health provision on Skye, Lecalsh and South West Ross. They're calling as a priority for 24/7 urgent care to be restored at Portree Hospital and the beds that have been lost there to be reinstated. So while recognising that it's NHS Highland that has been unable to deliver on those recommendations, can I ask the First Minister, will he or his Health Secretary, if still in place, agree to meet with campaigners in Portree and hear first-hand their frustrations and their concerns over what those ongoing delays in restoring services means for families and communities in North Skye, and how his government will help ensure those recommendations are delivered?
First Minister.
I'm not sure what that has to do with medicine shortages, but on the point of the actual services that Jamie Halcrow-Johnson raises, of course, I will ensure that the Cabinet Secretary for Health continues to engage with members, continues to engage with NHS Highland. I'm aware of the issue in my time as Health Secretary, and what I can give an assurance to both Jamie Halcrow-Johnson and constituents in Skye that, of course, we have provided an increase to NHS Highland's budget. We provided an increase to the NHS, a record over £19.5 billion of funding going to the NHS. That's because, of course, we prioritised investment in the NHS and public services as opposed to prioritising tax cuts for the wealthy, in stark contrast to the UK Conservative Government. So I will, of course, ask the Health Secretary to continue to engage with Jamie Halcrow-Johnson and indeed with NHS Highland.
Question number 5, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what impact he anticipates the Scottish Government's decision to remove the target to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 will have on infrastructure projects throughout Scotland.
First Minister.
I think Liam Kerr has a brass neck to raise infrastructure projects with me when his Tory colleagues in Westminster are responsible for our £1.3 billion cut to our capital budget to 27/28. Investment in Scotland's infrastructure we know is vital for our sustainable economic future, and investment in net zero brings huge employment and economic growth opportunities. That's why last week we reaffirmed the Scottish Government's unwavering commitment to deliver net zero by 2045 and announced a whole new package of climate action to strengthen our existing bold measures to help achieve and deliver net zero. These include a commitment to publish a new route map for the delivery of approximately 24,000 additional electric vehicle charge points by 2030 through a mix of public and private finance. And our budget has committed substantial funding towards delivery of our climate change goals.
Liam Kerr.
Well, the First Minister is ignorant of having the largest cash terms block grant in history, of course. And one infrastructure project promised in 2011 to stimulate the economy, reduce emissions and stop the senseless carnage was the dualling of the A96. Now, the Green Party demanded an unnecessary climate review to stall and prevent that, which, having cost £5 million so far, and despite £37 million already spent on preparatory work, will not report until the end of the summer. Now, that the beyond credible targets and the economically illiterate Greens have been jettisoned, can the First Minister confirm that all barriers have been removed from finally fully dualling the A96?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Liam Kerr talked about an unnecessary climate review. It's incredible language when 2023 was the hottest year on record, when we've seen extreme weather events, if not by the day, by the week, by the month, right across the world, including here in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And yet Liam Kerr says that it was an unnecessary climate review in the face of all that evidence. That's why the Conservative Party are fast turning into a party of climate deniers, Presiding Officer, when what we need, of course, is further climate action, which we will promise to bring forward. And of course, the reality of the situation is that when we look at the real terms, there will be a £1.3 billion cut to our capital budget over the coming year. So we'll continue to invest in infrastructure right across Scotland, as we have done in the North East, be that through the AWPR, new station at Kintor, be that through health infrastructure in relation to the Baird Family Hospital and other infrastructure projects. We'll continue to do that. But if Liam Kerr had any influence whatsoever, he'd be telling his Conservative colleagues in Westminster to overturn the disgraceful £1.3 billion capital cut.
Question number 6, Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I refer to my voluntary register of interest as I receive support from Stop Ecocide International to ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the report scoping a domestic legal framework for ecocide in Scotland, which was published by the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland.
First Minister.
The Scottish Government is committed to protecting our natural environment to ensure that there are appropriate legal consequences for those who cause significant damage. I know that Monica Lennon is also committed, of course, to that objective. I welcome this report. It's a valuable contribution to the debate on how the law can best achieve this goal. The report demonstrates the complexity of considering a standalone criminal offence of ecocide and will take time to consider the recommendations. The Scottish Government's starting point will be to consider the new European Environmental Crime Directive. The directive requires the introduction of new qualified offences where damage comparable to ecocide has been caused. It is our consistent aim to remain aligned where appropriate with developments in EU law and EU environmental standards.
Monica Lennon.
I thank the First Minister for his response. It's good to get that on the record, and I'm grateful to members across the Parliament for their constructive cross-party engagement with my Members' Bill proposal on ecocide law for Scotland. Preventing severe environmental harm is vital to protect nature and climate, to support a just transition for workers and communities, and to help our economy deliver for the people of Scotland. In these uncertain times when climate action is needed more than ever, will the First Minister confirm that his government is committed to working with me and all parties and stakeholders on the contribution that ecocide prevention can make, including continuing the positive dialogue I've had with ministers on my Members' Bill?
First Minister.
Yes, I can commit to continuing to engage constructively with Monica Lennon on this important Members' Bill. I think it is important to say that there have been some challenges that have been aired in relation to designing a new criminal offence, and they have to be considered. I know Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, the report concludes that, and I quote, "There are reasons for Scotland to be cautious before simply integrating the internationally recognised definition into domestic law." I know Monica Lennon is very aware of that, working through these issues. So I do look forward to seeing the detail of Monica Lennon's draft bill, and of course we continue to commit to work constructively with her on the detail.
Thank you. We move to general and constituency supplementaries, and I call Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Who does the First Minister think he is pleased most today? Is it Douglas Ross, Fergus Ewing or Alex Salmond? And more to the point, which of them does he think he can rely on for a majority in Parliament now?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, obviously Patrick Harvey and I spoke this morning, and I go back to the points and the comments that I made this morning. I do thank Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater for their contribution to this government, to their contribution to this country, and I think we can parties take great pride in what the Bute House Agreement has achieved in almost 3 years.
Let's hear the First Minister.
It is time for the SNP to govern as a minority government, to reach out on an issue-by-issue basis to other political parties right across this chamber in the best interest of this country. And I believe that there are many issues that unite us, and one of those issues that unite, for example, the SNP and the Green Party, one that we will never demur from in any way, shape or form, is that we think all decisions about Scotland are best made by the people of Scotland.
I call Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The UK Government's decision to reject out of hand the EU's youth mobility offer to make it easier for people aged between 18 and 30 in the UK to study and work abroad in the wake of Brexit shines a dark light on their ideological obsession of a hard Brexit and a perverse desire to submit to the right wing, with Labour hell-bent on an outright outwinging of the Tories on Brexit. Does the FM share my concerns and will he make it clear today that the Scottish Government will continue to fight for the restoration of freedom of movement so that people across the UK can continue to study and work in the EU?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Anna Sarwar on the front bench is getting extremely agitated by that question, and no wonder, because he's embarrassed by Labour's dismal response to the youth mobility scheme. I would expect a Tory UK government to completely reject the European Commission's, I think, sensible proposal to negotiate a youth mobility scheme. For Labour to do that is just another example of how they're moving away from their principles. What on earth does the party even stand for if they will not stand for a youth mobility scheme with the European Commission? The ending of free movement has damaged the future of our young people. Again, in Scotland, part of the United Kingdom that did not vote for Brexit. We've long argued that our young people should enjoy the opportunities offered by mobility, such as study and work experience. We urge the UK Government to respond positively to this proposal and to negotiate a deep and generous agreement with the European Union.
Sue Webber.
Officer. First Minister, last week your government scrapped the Scottish Government's commitment to reducing carbon emissions by 75% by 2030. And the Cabinet Secretary stated, "We accept the CCC's recent re-articulation that this Parliament's interim 2030 target is out of reach. We must act now to chart a course to 2045 at a pace and on a scale that are feasible, fair and just." With that in mind, First Minister, the residents of Winchborough presented a petition of over 2,000 signatures to your government last week, asking for a train station to be built, one that serves their town and the surrounding area. A station that could take almost 500,000 car journeys off the road. Will your government now take the lead and back and build a station at Winchborough?
First Minister.
Officer, we have a proud record of infrastructure on building on our railways. That job, though, becomes markedly more difficult when Sue Webber's party takes a hatchet to our capital budget, cutting it about £1.3 billion over the next few years. And when it comes to, of course, ensuring that we take action to tackle the climate crisis, what would be exceptionally helpful if the Conservatives didn't oppose every single measure we bring forward to tackle the climate crisis. So, of course, the Transport Secretary, or indeed other members of the Government, because she may well be recused from the Winchborough decision, will, of course, look at that petition that has been brought forward. But I say once again to Sue Webber, our investment in infrastructure is very much hampered by the fact her Conservative Government has instructed a £1.3 billion capital cut in real terms to our budget.
Carol Malkin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We have with us care workers in the gallery today, bringing the S2UC's Missing Millions campaign to Parliament. First Minister, can the Government hear the workers outside and answer them? Does the Scottish Government support the S2UC's Missing campaign? And will this Government ever deliver for our essential care workers?
First Minister.
Well, my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Marie Todd, indeed, will both be meeting with care workers. We meet regularly with care workers. It's why, of course, as part of the budget, which I think Carol Malkin voted against, we instructed a pay rise for social care workers, another pay rise for social care workers to £12 an hour. And what I haven't seen from the Labour Party in any budget negotiations, particularly over the course of the last year, was make one suggestion, one costed suggestion of how they would increase the pay of social care workers. In fact, I don't think they've made one single costed suggestion in relation to how we would invest in social care. So we'll continue to invest in our social care workers, engage with our social care workers, and that, of course, is why the National Care Service and getting some support from the Labour Party around that would be most helpful, because it will increase the terms and conditions of social care workers right across the country.
John Mason.
Thank you. Can I ask the First Minister what the Government's reaction is to the recommendation that local councillors should be paid £24,500 from the 1st of April?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, we will, of course, look and consider the recommendations of the Independent Scottish Local Authority Remuneration Committee in partnership with COSLA. It's important that appropriate consideration and deliberation is applied, and a response will be published in due course. I can confirm that councillors have already received a 6.2% uplift for 24-25 through the current legislation. And I would, of course, say to members to refer to my register of ministerial interest, where my wife is currently a serving councillor.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On a visit to Prestwick Airport by the Economy and Fair Works Committee this week, we learned that the engineering cluster that includes the airport and surrounding companies are burgeoning at the seams and are desperate to expand. However, there is a severe shortage of apprentices This is also a message from potential investment from HLCC at Hunterston. Ayrshire College is very keen to deliver the apprenticeships required, but have had the apprenticeship funding cut. There is now £84 million of public funding put back into the pot with the demise of the Mangata proposal at Prestwick. That was an investment from the Ayrshire Growth Deal. Through the Regional Skills Initiative, does it not make sense to redeploy this money, invest in the Ayrshire College apprenticeship programme and solve the issues that Ayrshire's engineering works are facing?
First Minister.
Can I say to Brian Whittle, he does raise a very important point indeed, and I'm grateful to him for raising it in the Chamber. In terms of the Ayrshire Growth Deal, that will then be a decision, of course, for all of the partners as part of the Ayrshire Growth Deal. I do thank Brian Whittle. He's made a suggestion that is well worth exploring, particularly in relation to the funding for apprentices. We know how valuable they are, how valuable the apprenticeship scheme is. So Brian Whittle has made a suggestion in this Chamber. I promise him that we'll take a look at that, and local partners, as part of the Ayrshire Growth Deal, I would encourage them to also take a look at the suggestion that Brian Whittle has made, and let's see if we can find a resolution.
Daniel Johnson.
In recent days, there has been worrying reports regarding Scottish Government delays in allocating employability funding. Failure to confirm funds to local authorities for the No One Left Behind programme is having a devastating impact on training organisations. 40 people across the sector have already been made redundant, with many more at risk if funding is not released quickly. Skills and employability systems should be about creating opportunities, not making people redundant. So what commitment can the First Minister give to training providers and those they seek to help as to when this crucial funding will be released?
First Minister.
Well, take an immediate look at the particular example that Daniel Johnson raises in this Parliament. Of course, we have a good record on employability grants over the years, the apprentices that have been created, the employability opportunities that have been created, particularly for some of the most marginalised groups in our society. And of course, it is important those grant letters get out the door as soon as possible so that the situation that Daniel Johnson mentions does not transpire. So we will take a look at the specific example that Daniel Johnson has raised, and I'll make sure the appropriate Cabinet Secretary writes it.
Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First Minister, there's a well-established business in West Linton supplying log-burning stoves and accessories. Very concerned that after 30 years the business may very well be under threat. I understand that clean, eco-design wood-burning stoves with locally supplied wood can be used in conjunction with other renewable energy heating options, and this is supported, I understand, by a government study just a few years ago. Can I ask the First Minister to ask the appropriate Cabinet Secretary to revisit that study, as this may affect other small rural businesses?
First Minister.
Yes, I will, of course, ensure that we continue to keep those regulations under review. What I would say to Christine Graham, of course, there are appropriate, we know, exemptions in place, and we do take account of unique circumstances, particularly in rural and island Scotland. So I will ask the Cabinet Secretary to take a look at the detailed case that Christine Graham raises and write back with some of that detail and provide an update to Christine Graham.
Finlay Carson.
The Rural Divide is a new report by the charity Change Mental Health, which reveals the stark inequalities facing children and young people in rural Scotland when accessing mental health care services. In NHS Dumfries and Galloway, some 44% of children and young people were not seen by CAMHS within the 18-week of referral. This report shows us once again that children and young people in some of our most rural areas aren't getting the support they need and when they need it. The First Minister has overseen closure of our rural hospitals, closure of our rural maternity services and the industrialisation of our rural landscape. His government has repeatedly failed rural Scotland, and now his government is letting down young folk in our rural communities. Will the First Minister commit to delivering targeted action to tackle these significant rural mental health inequalities?
First Minister.
We have, of course, under this government, not just double investment in mental health, we've, of course, ensured that we've recruited more and more staff, record levels of staff in CAMHS and the mental health services. So we've got, again, a proud track record of investing in mental health. We know there's challenges, particularly as we recover our services post the global pandemic. Organisations like Change Mental Health are very important right across the country, but I will ask the Minister has responsibility for mental health to write to Finlay Carson around the actions we are taking nationally but also locally in order to support people who are facing some difficult challenges with their mental health.
Emma Harper.
First Minister, news research from HMRC has shown that thousands more taxpayers moved to Scotland than left each year in the period after Scottish income tax was introduced. This seems to be somewhat at odds with the warnings from the Tories and even some Labour members that progressive taxation would deter taxpayers from coming to live here. Does the First Minister agree that this confirms that Scotland is an attractive place to live and work, with a progressive approach to taxation that raises additional funds for public services?
First Minister.
I do agree, Presiding Officer, with that, and it flies in the face of some of the rhetoric that we hear from the opposition. The opposition claiming, of course, that the fact that we have progressive tax will somehow lead to an exodus of Scots. What the HMRC data has shown, of course, is that more people from the rest of the United Kingdom want to come to Scotland as opposed to those who are leaving Scotland. And I can tell you one thing, Presiding Officer, the opposition absolutely hate that fact. And the simple fact is that people choose to live and work on a range of factors, not just tax. In Scotland, people have access to a range of services that simply don't exist elsewhere in other parts of the UK, such as free prescriptions, such as, of course, free access to higher education. And that latest HMRC data confirms an average of 4,200 more taxpayers coming to Scotland from the rest of the UK than left since 2017-18. In 2021-22, the latest year of data, net migration of taxpayers has improved, and this is crucial, across all tax bands, and £200 million in additional taxable income was brought into Scotland. It's for others, of course, to set out how slashing taxes, running down our public services, would make Scotland a better place to live, work, study and do business in. I don't think that's the case.
Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, I chaired a meeting with campaigners and businesses representatives on anti-racism in the workplace. I was disappointed to hear that so many in our businesses and our public organisations felt unable to report the racial abuse they faced at work. Can the First Minister outline what measures the Scottish Government is taking to empower people to report racial abuse in the workplace?
First Minister.
I thank Faisal Chowdhury for raising an exceptionally important question, and also, of course, at the time before he was a member of the Scottish Parliament, he was raising these issues as chair of LREC and other such organisations consistently over the years. So he's been a tireless campaigner against racism and hatred of any form over many years. In terms of the actions we're taking, I'll ensure the Cabinet Secretary for Justice writes to Faisal Chowdhury with the detail. But that's why, for example, third-party reporting centres are really important. And they've had some misinformation and disinformation over the weeks and months of the importance of why they exist. They are important because some people may not quite feel as confident reporting directly to the police. Now, we have to remove those barriers, dismantle those barriers where they exist, and third-party reporting centres can play a role in that. But I will ask the appropriate Cabinet Secretary to write to Faisal Chowdhury with the detail of what we're doing so that everybody feels safe in the workplace to be able to report racism wherever it exists.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. The next item of business is a members' business debate in the name of Liam Kerr, and there will now be a short suspension to allow those leaving the chamber and public gallery to do so before the debate begins.
to do so as quickly and as quietly as possible as we resume business. And the next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 12727 in the name of Liam Kerr on the need for new railway stations north of the Central Belt. The debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press their request to speak buttons, and I call Liam Kerr to open the debate. Around 7 minutes. Mr. Kerr.
Yeah, thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to colleagues from across the Chamber who have supported my motion today. Presiding Officer, in 1956, the communities of Cove and Newton Hill lost their stations. But in recent years, both have expanded exponentially, such that Newton Hill has a population of more than 3,000 now, and Cove has more than 8,000. Surrounding areas like the lovely new town at Chapelton swell that even further. Yet Newton Hill remains connected to Aberdeen principally by the A92 and Cove by the A956. There is a far from regular or cheap and sometimes unreliable bus service, which takes nearly an hour to get from Newton Hill to Aberdeen, or at least half an hour from Cove. So it comes as no surprise that the number of people who use the car to travel between Newton Hill or Cove and Aberdeen was higher than the national average, as hard-working families are forced to rely on their cars to commute, get to school or college, and to see family and friends. And now, of course, they're faced with a massively unpopular LEZ in Aberdeen, random new bus gates and new parking charges when they get into the city. Now, CNER's Jordan Jack called it right when he said, building new stations for Cove and Newton Hill will give residents a sustainable travel choice while halving travel time and will open new economic opportunities. Indeed so. Just think of the environmental benefits as fewer people drive to the city and instead jump on a train, taking them right to the heart of a Union Street, which we so badly need to increase footfall to. Presiding Officer, that would decrease car use in a context where the Scottish Government acknowledges it's not really sure how to reduce car kilometres by 20% and will help achieve what I think the ill-thought-through LEZ won't. Think of the economic benefits, with more people looking to live in these fine communities while also working, shopping and schooling in the city. Or as Nestrans point out, the two new stations could service thousands of potential passengers each day travelling to Dundee and the Central Belt. Russell Borthwick, the Chief Executive of the AGCC, told me just this week the proposals to open Cove and Newton Hill stations would allow many people to access Aberdeen city centre for work and leisure at a time when measures to restrict car access continue to be extended. And just yesterday, the Railway Industry Association, who represent the vital supply chain within the rail industry, told me that greater investment in the rail network would help secure more jobs for the North East and beyond, and thus more spending in North East communities. And they reminded me that railway industry jobs are among the best trained and highest quality standards in the UK. And of course, there's the health and well-being angle as more people take sustainable public transport and active travel. Indeed, the Nestrans report specifically highlights opportunities to provide facilities such as secure cycle parking, cycle hire and EV charging points. But it's important to ensure, of course, that these communities want new stations. Well, Presiding Officer, 95% of Cove residents and 90% of Newton Hill residents who took part in the 2022 study say they would like to see a station in their area, and almost half of the population said, responding to the study, that new stations at Cove and Newton Hill would encourage them to use the train more. And the petition that I launched last summer in both localities has over 1,500 signatures. Even SNP councillor Miranda Radley agrees. When she was campaigning to get elected to council in 2022, she said, a train station in Cove just makes sense, and promised in her literature that if elected, she would help bring forward the delivery of a station in Cove. Now, I've written to her and Council Leader Christian Allard recently to say, OK, how have you actually enacted that? How are you actually delivering on that? Now, to date, I haven't had an answer, but I look forward to receiving that promptly. So, Presiding Officer, the support is there, but what about the practicalities? Well, the Nestrans report quotes £40 million
for 2 stations. Now, that is a lot of money, Presiding Officer, although only about 10% of the cost of 2 new SNP ferries. But the people of the North East well remember that the SNP government promised us £200 million to invest in North East Rail in 2016. And specifically, Nestrans note that funding, quote, may be an opportunity to introduce new stations on the line between Aberdeen and Lawrence Kirk. Now, disappointingly, only 3%. I will.
Douglas Lumsden.
I thank my colleague for taking an intervention. Does Liam Kerr have any confidence at all that that £200 million will actually be spent by the 2026, as was the commitment?
Liam Kerr.
Well, I'm not sure I do have confidence, Mr Lumsden, simply because only 3% of the funding has actually been delivered so far. What's that, about 8 years on? And the SNP government have recently suggested that the pledge is under review, so perhaps the Minister can allay those concerns in her closing. The Minister will, though, be pleased to note that Nestrans also suggests that external funding may be available for this package for the stations, subject to the funding application process, and that for both stations they are, quote again, on an existing line and would be serviced using existing services, and therefore operational costs are likely to be low. And the people of the North East, Presiding Officer, have watched, somewhat perplexed as the likes of Reston in the Borders, East Lothian, Leavenmouth in Fife have got what are excellent new lines and stations. And when SNP Angus Council decided to snub the opportunity of £18 million of free money to extend the Caledonian Railway in Brechin, people began to suspect that this was yet another Central Belt thing. But, Presiding Officer, this government has the chance to allay those fears. The people of the North East have spoken, with more than 1,500 local people signing my petition. Nestrans are on board. Cove Rangers, whose team are upgrading their stadium to increase capacity, back it. We know the environmental, economic and social benefits that proper public transport and stations would bring. The Parliament has shown its support through signatures on my motion. There is cross-party support. Presiding Officer, I'll finish with a quote from Keith Moorhouse, resident of Cove and chair of Cove Rangers, speaking about these 2 stations specifically. He said, "It's a no-brainer. The more and more rail links you put in and the more options you give people to travel, the better for everyone. Just get a move on." Amen to that, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. We now move to the open debate. I call first Kevin Stewart, to be followed by Douglas Lumsden, around 4 minutes. Mr Stewart.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I thank Liam Kerr for bringing this motion to the Chamber. And I think we will have a fairly good debate around about all of this today. First of all, Presiding Officer, I should probably put on the record that I was the chair of Nestrans between 2007 and 2011, and I am always pleased to see the good work that emanates from the offices of Nestrans, and I pay tribute to the people of the organisation for this report. I think I should also say that during the time of this SNP government, we have seen new stations in the North East, new stations that have made a real difference to the communities of the North East. The station at Lawrence Kirk opened. There was some scepticism about that station, but patronage was over 80%, if I remember rightly, greater than had been anticipated from the reports. And I'm very pleased that we have recently seen the station at Kintore open. Again, that has made a real difference to people. I think that Liam Kerr is right to highlight Newton Hill and Cove, areas that have grown in numbers, as he has said. But I think there are other opportunities in the North East of Scotland, and I would like to put on record my thanks to the Campaign for North East Rail for the work that they have done, not only looking at the opportunities for new stations and existing lines, but also looking at what can be done in terms of reopening the lines north, the Formartine and Buchan lines that should never have been closed, just like the stations at Cove and Newton Hill should not have been closed in 1956, as Mr Kerr has mentioned. This government has put a huge amount of money into the infrastructure of the North East. We have the Western Peripheral Route, thanks to the investment from this SNP government, and we have the investments that I have mentioned in terms of Kintore and Lawrence Kirk, but also to our advantage has been the opening of other stations on the Aberdeen to Inverness line, such as the one at Inverness Airport, which opened recently. And I think we should all take cognizance, whether we be from the North East or not, of the investment that the Scottish Government has made in our railways. And the most recent Rail Watch magazine, published in April this month, had a banner headline: Scotland shows the way. And Scotland does show the way, because there have been 5 successful rail station openings in the past 3 years. Reston opened in 2022, Inverness Airport in East Linton in 23, and later this year we will see the line to Cameron Bridge and Leavenmouth opening with the new stations there. Scotland does show the way, but we could do so much better for the North East, for the folk of Cove and Newton Hill, and maybe even Kitty Brewster and Bucksburn, if we had more money to spend on infrastructure. But unfortunately, the sad thing is that we have seen a massive reduction to our capital budget from the UK Tory government. That is money that could be spent on Cove and on Newton Hill, but unfortunately that is not there. However, to end in a lighter note, I think that we in the North East of Scotland recognise the growth in some of these areas. We recognise the difficulties that have been caused by the closing of railways in the past. And it is time to invest in our infrastructure. It is time to invest not only in Cove and Newton Hill, but also to look what can be done to open up new lines to the north of Aberdeen, like the Borders Railway and like Leavenmouth. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I now call Douglas Lumsden to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury. Around 4 minutes, Mr Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to my colleague and trained geek, I know he won't mind me calling that, Liam Kerr, for bringing this debate to the Chamber today. And, this is a vital debate for the people of the North East, to force the SNP government to look beyond the needs of the Central Belt and towards my constituents in the North East. Perhaps with their newfound freedom, having dropped the Green extremists, we can hope for more. My constituents are well too aware of poor access to railway services in the North East, whether that's the frequency of trains, accessibility of stations, reliability of services, or the time it takes to make a journey. All of those are areas that require improvement, and I welcome the valuable work of bodies like Nestrans, who are putting forward sensible solutions to the challenges of public transport. And I would like to know what the Minister's response is to their excellent preliminary appraisal of the Aberdeen to Lawrence Kirk multimodal transport corridor. And we have seen the difference new stations can make. In 2023, a new station opened on the Border Railway at Reston, and we have seen growth in that community before and since, with other services such as the on-demand bus transport feeding into stations and its links. And it's estimated that the economic benefit of that development will be well over £7 per £1 spent for the local community. And we've seen that it's possible, and we want to bring the same success to the North East and communities such as Cove and Newton Hill. Moving ahead with these projects would make a huge difference to those living around those communities and also to the centre of Aberdeen, a point that Liam Kerr made. More people would have an easy option to come and enjoy what the city centre has to offer. In Cove, a survey was done and the results were telling. 69% of respondents said that there are journeys they would like to make by rail but can't at the moment due to the lack of rail link. Businesses and individuals are over-reliant on their cars in these communities, And if this government are serious about reaching net zero and actually meeting some of their targets, then investment is needed in schemes such as this one. But why stop there, Presiding Officer? The campaign for North East Rail have also been calling for the East Coast Line to be extended up to Ellon, Peterhead and Fraserburgh. The campaigners have been doing an excellent job, and I hope that this devolved government will give this project real consideration in the years ahead. Mary McCallan said only the other day that the devolved government had missed most of their targets when it comes to net zero. Here is the opportunity to demonstrate commitment to the North East, commitment to net zero, commitment to multimodal transport systems, and a commitment to our railway network that is in dire need of investment. And when it comes to that investment in rail network, we must not forget about the promise made by this government back in 2016. That commitment was made to spend £200 million to reduce rail journey times between Aberdeen and the Central Belt by 20 minutes by 2026. 8 years down the line, very little has been spent and no journey time improvements have been made. This, like other grand announcements made by the SNP, seems like a lot of hot air. And I think everyone here knows there's not a cat in hell's chance of that commitment being made. Another broken promise by the SNP. If we can do it in the borders, then we can do it in the North East. And I'm proud to support my colleague Liam Kerr in bringing forward this motion for debate today. Because only the Scottish Conservatives are standing up for the North East. And only the Scottish Conservatives are talking about the issues that are at the heart of economic growth, securing jobs, stability and future of our residents. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by Audrey Nicholl. Around 4 minutes. Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to begin by congratulating Liam Kerr for getting this important issue to the Chamber. I welcome the Nesta report. The campaign for the new station in Newton Hill and Cove shows that people across Scotland are crying out for improved rail connection. Rail can do so much for communities. It can be a vital link for those in rural areas. The elderly or those who are not able to drive due to disability cannot rely on irregular and lengthy bus services. Tourists who can bring so much money into the communities outside of Central Belt use trains to see our country. And the ability to travel by train easily will play a massive part in reducing car usage on our path to net zero. So much of Scotland is poorly served by rail. The North East in particular is underserved when compared to other regions. A region which has been so important to Scotland's economy through agriculture, natural resources and fishing, to name just a few, is being neglected. And the demand is there. More than 225,000 journeys were made in the first 3 years of station being opened in Kinthorpe in Aberdeenshire. Imagine what more investment could do. I join members in thanking the Campaign for North East Rail for their campaigning for greater rail connections in North East. Local community campaigns for new rail are so important in bringing attention to areas which are underserved. For example, I recently joined residents of Winchborough, a village in West Lothian, in delivering a petition to the Minister for Connectivity, Jim Fairley, calling on the Scottish Government to name a date for the opening for a train station there. Residents and developers were granted planning permission in principle for the station 12 years ago. Yet, the first growing village is losing out. The success of the campaign for station in Cove and Newton Hill is gaining these feasibility studies with Liam Kerr's petition, which was signed by over 1,500 people, gives me a confidence that it is possible for progress to be made. To conclude, Presiding Officer, new rail stations prevent isolation of those living in our rural communities and bring tourists to places they would have previously ignored. Scotland has great potential for new rail all over the country, whether that be Winchborough, Fresherborough or Cove. Rail travel is good for the environment, good for the economy and good for people. I welcome this motion and hope a successful outcome of the studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chowdhury. I now call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Willie Rennie. Around 4 minutes, Ms Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I apologise to the Chamber as I may have to leave before the conclusion of the debate for a previous commitment. I'd like to start by thanking Liam Kerr for bringing this debate forward. This is an issue which we have a common interest in as North East MSPs. The Nestrans announcement that new rail stations at Cove and Newton Hill are to be examined in more detail as part of the work to develop sustainable travel between Aberdeen and Lawrencekirk is extremely welcome. And as Liam Kerr's outlined, Cove is a residential area on the south side of Aberdeen. Newton Hill is a commuter town a little further south. Both are in my constituency and both have historically had train stops serving the local populations. And I myself have supported these improvements since I was a councillor in the Torry Ferry Hill ward of Aberdeen City, and indeed I campaigned for the reinstatement of the train stops as part of my election campaign to the Scottish Parliament. And I have since remained focused and active on this issue, and indeed more recently written to the now Cabinet Secretary seeking her support in this matter. And I know Mr Kerr has been equally passionate and active on this issue. Presiding Officer, I think the question to be asked and answered here is why do we have such consensus on this issue? The Parliament is of course aware of the critical role of the North East, the critical role that the North East plays in our national economy. A skilled workforce is spread across a number of communities which were once standalone small towns and villages, but which now are now home to considerably bigger populations. And these communities continue to grow with further development situated or near these communities. Regional transport links to the south of Aberdeen are primarily road-based, with the exception of the Aberdeen to Central Belt rail links. And as we continue to transition to a greener economy, people have become conscious of the need to consider alternative, more green travel options. Local bus companies have delivered on green transport options, with both electric and hydrogen fleets expanding rapidly in recent times and serving communities across the area. North East communities at Newton Hill and Cove, as well as those further north along the Ellen and Peterhead corridor, are aware of the post-beaching cuts to their communities, and to one extent or another the infrastructure still exists that would make modern transport links viable again. The communities of Cove and Newton Hill, like others in the North East, are seeking innovative connectivity locally with wider regional centres and beyond. Proposals for electrification and opening new rail links closed under beaching offer the multimodal options which our communities are now seeking as a necessary part of 21st century living. Presiding Officer, a previous Nestrans study on multimodal transport along the Aberdeen to Lawrencekirk corridor indicated a clear willingness from residents to support improvements to the rail network, which I believe opening the stations at Cove and Newton Hill would bring. And where similar improvements have progressed, such as at Kintor, previously mentioned by members, it has become clear very quickly that projects to deliver local transport infrastructure make a significant positive difference to local residents. To put the Kintor improvements into focus, the last figures for journeys to and from the station provide passenger numbers of around 85,000 per annum, with a population half of that of the combined populations of Newton Hill and Cove. And so Kintor has shown us the way forward to provide travel options for our communities, and this can and should be replicated elsewhere. And I hope the Nestrans appraisal brings forward a positive case for Cove and Newton Hill stations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Nicholl. I now call Willie Rennie to be followed by Tim Eagle. Around 4 minutes, Mr Rennie.
I thank Liam Kerr for bringing this debate and for making a very compelling case, as is Audrey Nicholl just at the moment. I know Newton Hill and Cove very well. They are large and growing communities. They are very mobile communities, and I think there is a very powerful case for just allowing the trains to stop through those communities. We're not talking about new railway lines, we're just stop the trains in those communities to let the passengers on. So relatively low-cost options for quite a big impact, which I would regard as the same for Newborough in my constituency, not in the far north-east as I would regard it, certainly in north of the Central Belt, because Fifers in the north-east of Fife don't regard ourselves as Central Belters. But I want to make the powerful case, I think, that has been developed by the campaign in Newborough in Fife. It's got huge local support, as is Newton Hill and Cove. They're united. Young and old are really motivated by this campaign, and it's gathered support from neighbouring communities as well, like Abernethy over into Perth and Kinross. The low cost, I think high impact, is very clear in this case. It would mean a 12-minute journey to Ladybank or to Perth. The railway line runs right through the borough. They are proposing a modular station, which would be relatively low cost. And it's a part of Fife that's quite cut off from other parts. For those who don't know it, it's right on the Tay estuary, and there's a big potential economic boost because it's not the wealthiest part of my constituency, and there's a big move now towards more estuary living, and this fits right into that potential. So I think the economic boost that would be brought to that part of Fife would be significant, and that certainly was one of the strong arguments, I believe, for the Leave in Mouth campaign, was the economic boost that it would bring to that part of Fife. And I do congratulate the government for getting that scheme up and running, and it will be open within days, and I think that would be great for the east of Fife. And I think the case for that there was that we'd be bringing significant economic developments. But we can't just rest on our laurels with that. There is a shortage of finance, as Kevin Stewart has highlighted, so we need to identify schemes that are quite low cost, but will have a big impact. And I think both Newton Hill and Cove and Newborough in my constituency meet that criteria. But the process is incredibly slow, especially for this low-cost process. The budget that Sestrans has set aside for this has already been blown apart because of the extra requirements that's been placed upon them by Transport Scotland. They first submitted their STAG in June 2022. It took 6 months for comments to come back from the government. They resubmitted their proposal, and it took another 6 months for comments to come back, and we're going on and on. I suspect that process will carry on for a very long time. So I hope that the Minister would perhaps reflect on the fact that there seems to be a disproportionate time and cost involved for schemes that are actually relatively low cost, but again, quite a big impact. So I hope that we could perhaps adjust the process to make sure that schemes like Newborough have got a better chance of progressing much more quickly. Because, as I say, the government has made some good progress on Leave in Mouth and other schemes, but there will be a dearth of schemes coming through now, and I hope that they identify that low-cost, high-impact schemes is something that they should be adopting. So I would urge the Minister to reflect on the process, to look again at Newborough and advance Newborough up the priority list alongside Newton Hill and Cove. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. I now call Tim Eagle to be followed by Karen Adam. Around 4 minutes, Mr Eagle.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. And my thanks also to Liam Kerr for bringing this. I must admit, I didn't know he was a train buff, but we'll pick on that later on. But he brings an important debate, doesn't he, about how we need to be proactive, or the government needs to be proactive about connecting communities on the rail network as they expand and grow across the whole of Scotland, and particularly acute for myself up in Murray. In fact, after this debate, I'm going to be running down to the train station at Waverley to get a train right the way back to the very north in Keith. So as we approach May, the sun rising on the horizon, the warmth in the air, I don't really want to talk about Christmas, but I was wondering if I should contact some of my constituents in Oban and the Argyll and Bute who have contacted me about what they are now calling the Polar Express on the West Highland line, which is so cold in the mornings that they are wrapping themselves up in sleeping bags. And perhaps they should get some sponsorship from ScotRail in order to do a live-action remake of Every Day on the run-up to Christmas. It's an important point that they're raising, not just because of the health concerns around hypothermia on that line, but that we need a modern infrastructure, not just for the stations, but the rolling stock that we have. And I hope that we will see that situation remedied very soon. It was reported in the Oban Times recently, and I'm glad of that report because it brings to light the concerns not just in Oban, but across the Highlands and Islands, which I represent. It's great to hear from Liam Kerr that the populations of Cove and Newton Hill have expanded considerably in recent years, and with that, they most certainly warrant those new train stations that he's asking for. Conversely, however, many communities across the Highlands and Islands region which I represent are witnessing alarming rates of depopulation, in part because of a lack of infrastructure, investment in such infrastructure. Argyll and Bute is at particular risk, with a report published by Spice in 2022 showing that Argyll's islands experienced the highest depopulation in Scotland over the last 20 years. The Isle of Bute was worst hit, and it, of course, is heavily reliant on both a ferry service and rail infrastructure at Wemyss Bay. But this issue is affecting all parts of my region, and more investment is needed. This was recognised during the initial option appraisal carried out as part of the Strategic Transport Project Review too. That initial process was very forward-thinking. It suggested that there could be a new rail connection to and from Cow to the West Highland Line and also to Kintyre through the use of fixed links. It suggested improved rail connectivity between Oban and London through the introduction of a sleeper service. That would have been very welcome over there and would have helped with tourism as well. It even suggested that the rail network could be extended to the islands via fixed links. But disappointingly, none of these suggestions made it to the final recommendations in the report. No new stations, no new lines. In the end, that report only recommended corridor enhancement to the Highland Main Line, basically passing places. That's all it recommended in the end. That, for me, is a massive missed opportunity to the Scottish Government. However, all is not lost. Hightrans announced a consultation on its new draft regional transport strategy, which sets out a 20-year vision for transport improvements across the Highlands and Islands. I particularly welcome its support for the planning and delivery of new railway stations. The devil, of course, will be in the detail, but this is hopeful news for the Highlands and Islands. Deputy Presiding Officer, the Highlands and Islands needs more train stations, but it also needs wider investment across the board on infrastructure, especially if we are to tackle the real issues of rural depopulation. And I would love it if we could cure once and for all our Polar Express.
Thank you very much, Mr Eagle. I now call Karen Adam to be followed by Sue Webber. Around 4 minutes, Ms Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I thank Liam Kerr for bringing this debate to the Chamber. It wasn't too long ago, I think we were walking the Buchan line together in the North East sunshine, which does happen, with the then Transport Minister, Jenny Gilruth. Because of that meeting, that my team and the Campaign for North East Rail were at, we had discussions in regards to the Just Transition Fund. And actually, a member of my team suggested that the Campaign for North East Rail apply for this. So I must say and put on record that the Scottish Government has been a great supporter of the Campaign for North East Rail, and in every conversation that I brought to them in that regard, and particularly awarding them £250,000 from the Just Transition Fund for that feasibility study to explore the possibility of passenger and freight services running north of Dice, onwards towards Peterhead and Fraserburgh. And we will be expecting the findings of that feasibility study very soon. I recently held a survey which received more than 1,000 responses, and 2 in 5 of them said they relied on bus services to attend NHS appointments. We know that bus journeys to ARI take 2 or 3 times as long as car journeys. Connecting our coast is about more than transport. It's necessary for the health, safety and well-being of my constituents. From carbon capture projects to wind farms, our North East corner is playing a vital role in delivering Scotland's transition to net zero, but that means HGV levels on the roads remain consistently high, and that's every hour of every day of the working week. The key difference between the Campaign for North East Roads study compared to previous studies is the key focus on rail freight opportunities in the area. Reconnecting Fraserburgh and Peterhead to the railway would allow many of these HGV movements transferred to the rails, resulting in cleaner air, fewer emissions, safer roads and further economic growth opportunities. Peterhead and Fraserburgh have been identified as regeneration priority areas. Unemployment in Fraserburgh and Peterhead is higher than the national average. So we have a chance here to replicate the success that we've seen in other schemes, such as the Borders Railway, and bring real regeneration to some of the most deprived areas in Aberdeenshire. The Peterhead South Pier, operated by ASCO, is the largest offshore support facility in Europe, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will join me in celebrating the fantastic news this week that the world's biggest offshore floating wind farm is set to be built just off the coast of Peterhead. This project will bring billions to Scotland's economy, the Blue Tune and the Broch, as affectionately known. Peterhead and Fraserburgh will be vital to this site, and they will expect heavy equipment, parts and specialised workers coming to the area once this wind farm is up and running. Yes, I will.
Douglas Lumsden.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. I think it's great news for Peterhead. But does projects like that not just make the need for improvements like Tola Burness even more vital, and the government really need to get on with that because it is a real safety issue?
Karen Adam.
I thank the member for that intervention, and I do support any calls for road improvements and infrastructure in the North East, but I'm going to get on to a point later in that in my speech. So I wholeheartedly welcome the growth in my constituency, but we must recognise that the existing infrastructure is already congested with HGV, bus and car traffic, and introducing rail will go a long way to providing much welcome relief. Presiding Officer, I want to conclude by asking the Scottish Government if they will continue to support the Campaign for North East Rail work by continuing to consider funding for this project, such as detailed options appraisal when analysis of the latest study is complete. But let me be clear here. We are putting, obviously, a lot of pressure on the Scottish Government to help and support, and as rightly so, and that is our job as constituency MSPs here. But the UK Government has a part to play in this as well. And if a fraction of the cost that was spent on high-speed rail south of the border was spent in the North East corner, we wouldn't just have rail to Peterhead to Fraserburgh. It could go to Banff and Buckie and beyond. We have the potential to make boom time for the North East and beyond, Presiding Officer, and I hope we all recognise and take full advantage of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Adam. I now call the final speaker in the open debate, Sue Webber, around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Liam Kerr for bringing this debate to the Chamber this afternoon. Improving rail connections in the North East is not just a regional benefit, but will be a national benefit and a national priority. By enhancing the infrastructure in the North East, we not only foster local community cohesion, but also bolster the entire country's transport network. And members will be very aware that there are other initiatives across the country, including the campaign to open a train station on the existing main line in Winchborough in West Lothian. And this exemplifies strategic investments that can significantly contribute to broader economic and social development across Scotland. And the same benefits have been clearly articulated by the North East members here today, and specifically by Liam Kerr. Winchborough is a vibrant and growing community in West Lothian, which currently finds itself isolated from the national rail network because the trains pass on by, and as Willie Rennie mentioned, they don't stop there either. The lack of direct access severely restricts the ability of residents to reach essential medical services, pursue educational opportunities and connect with employment opportunities. The establishment of a new railway station would dramatically enhance connectivity, ease congestion in West Lothian and the west of Edinburgh, and support our ambitions to provide sustainable transport solutions. And I want to commend Winchborough Developments Limited for their commitment and substantial contributions towards making this vision a reality. Their involvement is a testament to the power of community and the corporate collaboration in driving forward public projects. And they too, along with the community of Winchborough, presented a petition of over 2,000 signatures to the Scottish Government. So again, this is reflected in terms of community empowerment, with a petition that was presented by Cove and Newton Hill that had over 1,500 signatures. Winchborough Developments Limited is the principal landowner and has worked in partnership with Winchborough Community Council and the Community Development Trust. The developer has already funded a new junction on the M9 to alleviate congestion and has shown considerable commitment to expanding the community. It's now time for the Scottish Government to match that. And like Cove and Newton Hill, this region anticipates a significant population growth. Up to 4,000 new families as a direct result of investment leveraged from the Edinburgh and South East Scotland City Region deal will move here. Demand for more robust public transport options has never been more urgent, and the area will continue to grow. The new station at Winchborough is essential. It's not only a necessity to alleviate mounting congestion here in our capital city, but a critical factor in meeting the Scotland Government's failing net zero ambitions. The pace of progress has been staggeringly slow and bogged down in bureaucracy. Despite repeated promises to do so, Transport Scotland still hasn't shared Network Rail's cost estimate or design estimate with the developer. This is delaying any realistic assessment the developer can make about how their contribution can be, and simply adds to the transport woes of the West Lothian community, which is getting larger by the month. But there could be some good news. This is a rare example of a station which won't need a wholly funded project from the public purse and will receive a generous contribution from the developer. Surely the Scottish Government should be pulling out all the stops to make that happen. Isn't that a model that could transform not just Winchborough, but so many of the badly needed infrastructure projects that we've heard about here this afternoon? So let me be quite clear. The needs of the community are obvious. The benefits of the project can be seen from either end of the crowded M8, and they all require urgent action from this SNP government to get something moving. No more meetings, no more talk about different types of meetings, just actual action. So I call yet again on Scottish ministers to actually do something. Re-establish the steering group to get this project moving and commit to a timetable to deliver a station to the communities around Winchborough without any furthermore obfuscation, I can't say that word today, or delay. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Webber. And I call on Fiona Hislop to respond to the debate. Cabinet Secretary, around 7 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, firstly, can I thank Liam Kerr for raising the subject of new railway stations, in this case at Cove and Newton Hill. Can I also thank the efforts of Nestrans and their stakeholders in progressing the work undertaken to date on this transport appraisal, which I will come back to later. However, before I do, I thought I would offer my own reflections on the topic of the desire for a new railway station. I have received requests for new stations on an almost weekly basis since I took on the transport portfolio, and we've heard that, I think, in all the contributions today. I understand the desire of both Newton Hill and Cove communities to see trains calling again at these stations after almost 7 decades after their initial closure. Both communities and the Campaign for North East Railway have worked over the years to highlight the case for rail enhancements in the region, and I admire the ambition of any local rail campaign, and I know firsthand, as a constituency MSP, what a new rail station can do for an area, having campaigned successfully for new stations at Armadale and Blackridge as part of the Airdrie-Bathgate line. And in my role as a constituency MSP, I am a firm, long-standing and continuing supporter for the campaign for the Winchborough railway station. The potential value and opportunities that a railway station can bring to a community has been proven again and again by our investment in rail. And I am therefore rightly proud of this government's record of opening new stations across Scotland, which stands at 18 to date and includes 2 in the North East at Lawrencekirk, opening in 2009, and Kintower, which we heard had opened in 2020. And this total is due to an increase by a further 2 in the coming weeks with the opening of the Leavenmouth rail line and its new stations at Cameron Bridge and Leven. And I have seen and heard what a new station means to a local community, having had the great pleasure of officially opening East Linton Station back in December. However, despite the numerous requests that I see for new stations and the evidence of the benefits that they may bring, I need to temper these with the realities of the many other priorities for new rail investment against the unprecedented challenge we face with regards to our capital position. Now, if I can turn now to the work led by Nestrans in terms of the study of transport and travel between Lawrence Kirk and Aberdeen. I am aware that the Aberdeen to Lawrence Kirk multimodal study started life back in 2020 and was commissioned with funding from the Scottish Government's Local Rail Development Fund. And following initial work, the study has evolved to incorporate and include the wider regional aspirations for an Aberdeen Rapid Transit project. And this is the same corridor as the initial LRDF study and includes the A90 and A92 towards Aberdeen. Taking the previous work and the most recent options for Aberdeen Rapid Transit has taken the study to completion of the preliminary options appraisal report. The recommendations from this phase of work has been approved by the Nestrans Board in February and includes options for strategic active travel interventions, implementation of a mobility hub facility to the south of Aberdeen, bus priority measures and new rail stations in Cove and Newton Hill. As all of these options have scored sufficiently well against the study's transport planning objectives and other appraisal criteria, they have therefore met the necessary threshold to advance to the next stage, which is a detailed appraisal. So moving forward, and in line with the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance, the next stage of work will involve a detailed appraisal of those shortlisted packages. I would therefore expect to see these options further developed and their impact quantified as part of that assessment. Now, this may include the packaging of options to identify the most effective solution for the corridor. It is at this detailed appraisal stage that I would expect to see potential passenger demand forecasts for each option, together with the detailed cost estimates and the outcome of any public and stakeholder engagement, which I understand from my officials that Nestrans are currently expecting to do this summer. All of this evidence gathered and consideration of the further risks will be required as part of that detailed assessment. But let me be clear, even if the detailed appraisal concludes that one or both of the rail stations may have a strong case to move forward, and my officials agree, there are a number of hurdles that need to be cleared before it can progress. Now, top among them is affordability. And as I've said on numerous occasions in this chamber recently, our ambitions to invest in Scotland's infrastructure have been severely hampered by the UK Government's failure to inflation-proof their capital budget.
Douglas Lumsden.
Yeah, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking that intervention. I'm listening carefully to the concerns about capital. Can you maybe explain what impact that's going to have on the £200 million investment that was meant to be made to reduce the journey times by 20 minutes by 2026? Is that now a project that is not going to be taken forward, because it seems that it hasn't moved very far in the 8 years?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member was in committee, and I think he actually asked Mary McCallan that very same point, and she talked about the need for us to review timescales. We have got commitments. I would say that the scope of that £200 million comprises of a series of infrastructure upgrades, including signal enhancement, station works at Aberdeen, Dundee, Montrose and Arbroath, new freight loops specific to enable the operation of more and faster trains on the same route. But of course, Mr Kerr would want to use that for Cove and Newton Hill. I think that was the suggestion from him. Yes, very briefly.
I'm genuinely grateful. On the capital point, when the line to Leven opens, which I think is the 2nd of June, there'll be only one station committed, which I think is Ball Grey. And I think that's being funded through the Glasgow City deal. Is that level of funding something that's being considered for Cove and Newton Hill?
Cabinet Secretary, I'll give you the time back for the intervention.
Thank you very much. Now, I think we have to be realistic. There is a cumulative loss of over £1.3 billion to our budget. So there are challenges to complete existing commitments, and obviously we've got additional commitments coming on top of that. That is why it's actually more important than ever that we do get those strong business cases and in terms of those stag appraisals and that detailed appraisal come through. And it's therefore, for this reason, I must be assured of the robustness of the study's final recommendations from Nestrans, particularly given that the work is now being funded through the Aberdeen City Region deal and that there may be calls for further Scottish Government investment in order to implement its recommendations. Now, I would reiterate that any changes to any City Region deal has to be agreed by all the partners, and I think everybody's acknowledging of that. So, President Officer, in conclusion, this Government remains committed to investing in our railways, including the opening of new station, where there's a strong business case to do so. And I think we have committed and demonstrated our commitment to the North East, not least by the contribution, I think, made by Karen Adam in terms of the rail line that she is pursuing. But let me be clear, it is vital that whichever option emerges from this Nestrans detailed appraisal, it needs to be backed by a strong evidence base supporting a business case for future investment. Without this, and without wishing to prejudice the outcomes of this work, this will be critical if that option is to require government support. So I do look forward to the conclusion of the detailed appraisal phase and the outcome of the work. I want to congratulate everybody involved in campaigning for Cove and Newton Hill, not least the communities that are involved, because I am, and I know from my knowledge that they will be passionate about wanting to secure that. And I'm sure, like me, Nestrans focus on making sure that the North East can achieve its ambitions for transport that it so rightly deserves can come to a conclusion that I'm sure the campaigners would hope would be successful.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30.